Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show and to the last in our series, looking at the key issues raised around the party conference season. Today we focus on the subtle shifts in Labour's position on Brexit and what that means for the upcoming and vital votes in both houses of Parliament. Can Labour succeed in forcing a general election drama out of the Brexit crisis? Or can Theresa May achieve the impossible and secure the passage of a Chequers agreement which virtually nobody supports with any enthusiasm whatsoever? But first, your tweets, your messages and your emails. And first up from Arthur, who says, "Bravo, Alex and Taz, one of the best amongst a great series of shows. So many voices representative of our modern nation. If Scotland's leading party and Yes movement got this coverage on its own media, the nation would have reclaimed its historic independence already." Thank you, Arthur. Very enthusiastic message. Pilar says, a lovely Pilar, "Excellent Alex Salmond Show about democracy and referendums. I always enjoy listening to Tricia Marwick, and so do I." And lots of praise for Tricia, in fact, for last week. Valerie also says, "Especially good to hear from Tricia Marwick, so knowledgeable on Catalonia. Outrageous that Carme Forcadell," and that's of course Tricia's counterpart in the Catalan Parliament, "has been imprisoned for facilitating debate." Margaret says, reacting to Alex Neil's comments, "Absolutely in relation to using our own currency." Carolyn Hunter says, "Get yourself dancing to some ABBA." Of course, Carolyn's referring to the Prime Minister's performance at her Tory party conference. There'll be none of that on the Alex Salmond Show. And finally from Barry Kirk, who, referring to independence, says, "We want it now, before we are dragged out of the EU." Now, by general consent, the Labour conference in Liverpool strengthened Jeremy Corbyn's position. Although the polls are still no better than level pegging, the Tory party high command are certainly taking the prospect of a Corbyn premiership very seriously indeed. Alex talked to the politician who one commentator described as the biggest winner at the conference, Derby Labour MP Chris Williamson, a man who not only saw every candidate he supported successfully elected to the new Labour NEC, but whose own odds on being Jeremy Corbyn's successor were slashed from 100 to 1 to 22 to 1.
Chris Williamson, Labour at their conference, a huge cheer for Keir Starmer when his impromptu reference to the potential of staying in, being on a ballot paper in a referendum. Are Labour edging towards a people's vote?
Now, our preference when we're talking about a people's vote would obviously to have a general election. That's what we would like to see, rather than this notion of a second referendum. Because the problem is, where do you stop with that? And my real fear as well, of course, is that it would embolden the far right. We've seen the rise of the far right across Europe, but also in this country. I never thought I'd see the day again where we'd have thousands of fascists marching on the street, but earlier this year we saw that with the support that Tommy Robinson achieved, and he's got over 1 million followers on social media as well. And I just think that the likes of Tommy Robinson, the extreme right in the Conservative Party, would be strengthened by a second referendum. It would be misrepresented. And I also think, just from anecdotal evidence and indeed from some of the polling, that the second referendum would be lost as well. So it would be a kind of a pointless thing to do, and it'd be an absolute Pyrrhic victory if they were to secure one through the House of Parliament if we ended up losing the second referendum. And then what would they be saying? Would we want a third referendum?
But there's a lot of polling evidence in the same polls which indicate that, at least among Labour members, there's pretty overwhelming support for a people's vote. Now, you're a great Labour member's person. That's what you've argued for all your political life. Don't you think you should listen to the membership on this basis?
The biggest cohort, as you'll know, Alex, in any election are the non-voters. And for me, I think our route back to power is to immobilise those voters, give them a reason to vote, hopefully inspire them to support the Labour Party. And my worry is that if we start talking about second referendum, many of those people in that cohort would be deterred, I think, and I think it would be perceived as a betrayal of the decision that was taken in 2016 in that referendum, albeit as close as it was.
Now, what united the whole conference, and indeed the Labour Party as a whole, and probably every member of Parliament from the Labour Party, is trying to get a general election. But you and I both know that the procedures in the House of Commons now make securing a general election extremely difficult. It's not just a question of having a vote of confidence anymore. You have to get a two-thirds majority of all members. Now, how can Labour possibly get a general election under these circumstances?
There's some speculation, even from within the Conservative Party, that if the Tories can't reach an agreement in the House, that there are a sufficient number of Conservative MPs who are prepared to vote in a vote of confidence to bring down the government. Now, That's a bit of a tall story, I accept, but who knows?
Most Labour, all Labour MPs are united to have a general election. Probably the one thing that unites certainly the vast majority, perhaps all Conservative MPs, is not having a general election. So even if Theresa May was to go as Prime Minister, it doesn't automatically mean a general election.
No, it doesn't automatically mean that. That's absolutely right. But I think it would be a bit of an untenable scenario for a new incumbent to, pick up the cudgels, as it were, given that they've got no democratic mandate. I think, Labour going into an election slightly ahead or slightly behind would be in a very, very strong position, bearing in mind the strength of our movement now and the ability we have to use social media to campaign in the way in which we did in a very innovative fashion in the last election. And we put on the biggest increase in vote share since 1945. So that would be another reason why I think the Tories would be fighting shy of it. But as I say, who knows? I mean, there are Tories who are saying they are prepared to bring down this government. And we'll have to wait and see, obviously.
Now, in the Liverpool conference, Labour made a pronounced and quite successful attempt to broaden the agenda beyond Brexit. But how is that going to be possible when you're coming into a House of Commons this autumn, which is going to be knife-edge votes on Brexit day and daily, or at least anticipated? How can Labour get across that broader agenda when the political dialogue is still dominated by Europe?
Yes, of course, people do have an interest in Europe, but people are, more concerned about, the state of the National Health Service and our public services in general. Are their kids going to be able to get a decent career? Tuition fees, keeping a roof over their head, spiralling house prices, and even getting a house in the first place. I mean, the average age now for the first-time buyer is around 37 or 38. These are the sorts of issues, are the bread and butter issues, I think, that people are most concerned about, rather than necessarily whether we are in or out of the European Union.
Now, let's face it, Labour are champing at the bit to have a general election. Realistically, there isn't any deal that Theresa May could come back with from Brussels that Labour MPs would vote for. But come on, you'd vote against anything she comes back with, even if she walked across the North Sea.
Well, I think it's pretty unlikely, to be fair. I mean, that's probably a fair comment, Alex. My worry, though, is that there's a lot of Tories, inside and indeed outside Parliament, who would be quite happy for there to be no deal, because their intention, in my opinion, is to turn Britain into a deregulated tax haven. That would be, nirvana from their perspective, because in reality, I think their main priority is representing, the elites in society. And, we've already in this country, even inside the European Union, workers in this country work more hours every single week. They work more weeks in every single year. They work more years in their life before they get a pension, and compared to the rest of Europe. And then they get one of the lowest pensions in Europe. So it hasn't exactly worked that brilliantly well for ordinary working people in this country over the last 40 years. And I think that's one of the main reasons why, the vote went the way that it did. And to be honest with you, I know some people criticise Jeremy Corbyn, but around 65% of Labour voters supported remaining inside the European Union. I think the real fault lies with New Labour and Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who didn't have a coherent or any industrial strategy to address the precarious employment, the housing crisis, the difficulties that people are facing in the coalfield communities, in the old mill towns and textile towns and manufacturing towns and cities up and down the country. And I think had we done that and given people a real stake, then I think we might have seen a very different outcome. And of course, the other thing they didn't do, in my opinion, was to sufficiently promote the positive benefits of being inside the European Union. All we ever seem to hear about in the media and indeed from politicians were the negative elements of being inside the European Union. I think that was the real difficulty, and that's why we've ended up in the situation that we're in today.
And finally, Chris Williamson, for odds checkers like myself who keep a close eye on political betting, another phenomenon of the Liverpool conference, your odds on being the next Labour leader went from 100 to 1 to 22 to 1. If called, would you say?
Don't bet. I wish, though, I've been talking about betting, I'd put a few bob on Jeremy Corbyn when he was 200 to 1 for the becoming the next leader of the Labour Party. Look, Jeremy's going to go on for a very, very long time. He's a vegetarian bordering on a vegan. I've been a vegan for 42 years. So, look, Jeremy's going to be the leader for the next probably decade. So that might be the time to start talking about who's going to be the next leader. And by that time, I'll be 72, for goodness sake. So there we are.
Chris Williamson, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
The most surprising standing ovation of the conference season was provoked by an unscripted remark of Labour Brexit spokesperson Sir Keir Starmer, who said that an in-out vote on Europe should not be excluded from any referendum. Hardly a resounding declaration of Liverpool, but enough to send delegates to their feet and some real encouragement for the campaign for the so-called People's Vote. This was followed by a full-scale SNP conversion, with a commitment from First Minister Nicola Sturgeon that the SNP would back it in a Commons vote. With the Liberals already in the bag, Alex asked Mike Galsworthy of NHS Against Brexit how much heart they'd taken from the party's conference moves towards a People's Vote.
Mike Galsworthy, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. Now, you're director of NHS Against Brexit, but also of Scientists for the EU. Are there particular issues in the scientific community and the health community which have mobilised you against Brexit?
Absolutely. 90% of UK scientists were for Remain. And the reason is very clear. We're internationalists, and the EU has been our team. And the money that we co-invest with the other EU countries, as well as the policies and regulations, have all allowed us extra value for money than we get just through domestic investment. So the EU is out-competing the US at the moment for science because we operate as a team, and that has been vital for the UK.
And the health service?
And the health service, we are already seeing strain on our NHS from Brexit. So because of the staffing issues caused by the government not guaranteeing EU citizens' rights, we're already seeing EU nurses leaving. They used to provide all of the growth for our nurses in this country.
So would you say the government's creating a hostile environment, to coin a phrase, for nurses and doctors?
They have continued their hostile environment. They treated EU citizens as bargaining chips, and this is what is driving them away as well as stopping them coming in. And then there is the fall in pound, which also strains on our NHS to the tune of about £1 billion a year in terms of extra costs on the NHS for purchase of equipment abroad or for compensating UK citizens getting healthcare abroad. And then now they have to prepare for a no-deal Brexit. Hospitals up and down the country thinking about how they stockpile medicines, thinking about what they're going to have to do if the whole system is disrupted.
Now, you're part of the People's Vote campaign, calling for another vote.
Yes.
A vote on the detail of whatever Theresa May comes up with.
Correct, yes.
How encouraged were you by the conference season, both the Labour conference and then the SNP conference?
Very encouraged, actually. So what you saw at Labour conference this year is something very different from last year. This year, you saw those bollocks to Brexit stickers everywhere. You saw a lot of speeches directly against Brexit right throughout the conference. You also saw well over 150 motions from local Labour parties, CLPs, come into conference demanding this people vote. A lot of them with saying an option to remain must be in there. And then this all came to a head. It was like a dam breaking, with some of the Labour leadership trying to resist it, being called out on it and then rolling back. And it really came to head with that Keir Starmer speech, where he decided to go off script and insert those extra words, which is no one is ruling out an option to remain. And that really set things alight, and that was the key moment from the whole conference.
So from the conference season, you could argue that Labour are edging towards the People's Vote. The SNP now seem to be on board. You've got the Liberals already. But what are the mechanics of actually securing a parliamentary vote on a second referendum? And indeed, do you have the numbers if you manage to get the vote?
Right, so the key thing is that the People's Vote is like a backstop. It's like, if everything goes to the wall, if it's a mess, then what do you do? So the path to a People's Vote is give Theresa May a fair chance to go negotiate a deal and bring that deal back. If she brings back a deal that is as rubbish as it looks now, then Parliament's not going to pass it, and the public also don't want it. Or if she can't get a deal, well, that can only go on for so long. And so at some point you say, actually, this isn't producing the goods, what do we do now? And then you've essentially got two things that you can do. And both of those will get an extension from the Commission. One is, let's have a general election and 2 new manifestos that spell out how they want to clear up the mess. And another one is, no, let's not do the general election, let's specifically focus on this issue about Brexit. Do we want to go ahead with the deal that Parliament have just rejected or something like it? Do we want to crash out, or do we want to drop the whole thing because, given what we've learnt over all this time, it's actually not as productive as we once thought?
Mike, in a word, do you have the numbers?
Yes, I think we do. I think when we get to that stage, we do.
Well, I don't know if I can give you the People's Vote, But I certainly can present you with the Alex Salmond Quake for appearing in the show.
Brilliant.
Oswald, thank you very much indeed.
Much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
You know the drill, incidentally. Whiskey and the quaif, all antiseptic, of course, and only Scotch.
Brilliant. Irish whiskey?
No, only Scotch.
Cheers.
Join us in a few minutes for a closer look at the lineup for vital votes in both Houses of Parliament this autumn. Can the Prime Minister pull off an unlikely Brexit triumph? Or will the fact that there's no enthusiasm for her Chequers proposal finally prove her undoing? Welcome back. It looks as if things are finally looking up for the beleaguered Prime Minister. 2 weeks ago, her Chequers compromise looked like a dead duck. Now, the top European officials are offering warm words, where previously they were pouring cold water. However, critics within and without her party suggest that actually the only reason that Chequers might now be acceptable to Brussels is that it is terrible for Britain. When it comes to a showdown in the Commons, 3 groups of people could prove vital. First, there is that small group of Labour MPs to whom finally securing Brexit might just be a higher priority than toppling the Prime Minister. Secondly, the DUP, on whose favours the government's survival depends, and who have warned that their lines on Brexit are coloured in blood red. Finally, the SNP have moved into the equation with a conference declaration that they will undoubtedly vote for a second Europol or People's Vote. Alex speaks to Labour MP Kate Hoey, currently touring the country with Nigel Farage and David Davis to keep the true Brexit flame burning, then to leading Democrat Unionist Sammy Wilson MP, and finally to the SNP MP Lisa Cameron.
Kate Hoey, coming out of the Labour conference in Liverpool, there was a bit of discussion that Labour could be edging towards supporting a People's Vote. Keir Starmer's impromptu standing ovation. Now, do you think Labour are moving towards a People's Vote?
Labour members and Labour supporters, or people who voted Labour, they don't want a second vote. You know, it is really, I think, a very, very destructive move that is going to be quite a sharp attack on democracy if, having told people this is a one-off vote, this matters, we're going to do what you decide, if we now decide to have another vote.
How about Theresa May's own position? I mean, she seems to be getting a bit friendlier reception towards the Chequers compromise, at least from the high Hegians in Brussels. Is there gathering support for Theresa May's Chequers position?
Well, I certainly don't have any more support for it now than I did at the beginning, and I'm not quite sure what her compromise is. And I think that's part of the whole mystique of this whole Brexit debate on both sides, both Labour and the Conservatives, that there is so much fudging going on with an attempt to try and appeal to different sides that actually we've no idea really where we are in terms of what the European Union are even thinking of accepting. And I think we will end up with such a fudge that actually it will not be something that Parliament put through. And I can't see at the moment the Chequers negotiation position as it is at the moment being accepted in Parliament.
So what would you say to the argument, if it's a hard Brexit or WTO Brexit that's being offered, that might move a Commons majority to no Brexit at all, or to a People's Vote to rerun the referendum? Well,
of course, there are some people who say, look, let's just get out at the end of March and then we can negotiate all these different details. I don't think the European Union will allow that to happen. But so I feel the votes that are coming up are pretty simple. People either want to leave properly or they want to stay in. And those people who want to stay in are going to vote for anything that gives them that little bit of, we're still around, we've still got the EU running us in some way or other. And that's not going to be acceptable to the 17 million people who voted to leave.
But Kate Hoey, finally, as an independent-minded Labour MP, if you were faced with a parliamentary choice between, on the one hand, having a genuine Brexit, a real leaving of the European Union, and on the other hand, perhaps the government falling in a general election, what would be your preferred option?
Oh, well, I'd be very happy to, have a general election. But I think the country probably doesn't want a general election, and the country won't really be, people in the country who voted leave will not look very kindly on people who threw away this wonderful opportunity to finally get, after 40 years, out of this anti-liberal, anti-democratic, neoliberal organisation.
Kate Hoey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Sammy Wilson, Arlene Foster, in a memorable phrase, said the DUP have some blood red lines on Brexit. What are they?
Well, the main line, and we have spelt this out from the very start of this process, is that the United Kingdom as a whole voted to leave the EU, and the United Kingdom as a whole will leave the EU. And if there are any attempts to leave Northern Ireland languishing in the stifling embrace of Brussels, then we will not be voting for any deal which consists of an arrangement such as that.
What would you say to those that say, look, the DUP eventually are going to have to choose between some sort of border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic, or some sort of border across the Irish Sea?
The Prime Minister, I think, dropped the ball at the very start, because she accepted that there was a problem with the Irish border, instead of kicking back and saying there isn't a problem, there doesn't need to be a problem. We can find ways of monitoring trade across the border, collecting taxes if they have to be collected and everything else, but she didn't. And of course, that's why we're now at the impasse that we are.
Arlene Foster met Monsieur Barnier this week in Brussels. You famously, as the DUP, managed to extract a deal from Downing Street. Is there anything Monsieur Barnier can say to you to do a deal with Brussels?
I think the difficulty with Michel Barnier is that Michel Barnier now knows he's got the UK on the run. I mean, he has seen the UK government to be a soft touch, and he will continue to dig his heels in as long as we keep compromising. And you look at many times the government has moved its negotiating position to accommodate the demands of Europe. And it's impossible then to do a deal with someone when you show such weakness. And I mean, I think that the Prime Minister has at this stage now got to consider, does she dig her heels in? Does she even take back some of the compromises she's already offered to the EU and say, I'll tell you what, we're going to have a fight about this now. And if you don't get this sorted out between now and March, you will finish up paying the consequences. You have German car makers will pay the consequences, French winemakers will pay the consequences, the Irish economy will pay the consequences because it will lose its main market in the GB. Now, we're up for a fight.
Well, the DUP are famous for their negotiating strength. But what would you say to people who say, look, when this comes to the crunch in the House of Commons, and you're faced with either Theresa May's plan or perhaps Jeremy Corbyn as the next Prime Minister, then you're not going to risk a Jeremy Corbyn government. What would you say to people who say, well, you've got your own problems?
We will not be browbeaten into accepting a compromise which we believe is detrimental to our part of the United Kingdom and to the United Kingdom as a whole.
And finally, Sammy Wilson, is there something that the Prime Minister, Theresa May, could say to you now which would gather your support in the lobbies?
No, it's not a case of what you say. It's a case of what is contained in the deal. And we have been saying to the Prime Minister and saying to the government, let us see what the text is that you're going to agree with the EU. Once we see that, then we will make our judgment. And, you know, we have given very clear guidance. And don't forget, we entered into this arrangement with the government in order to help deliver Brexit. Brexit would not have got as far as what it's got at present had it not been for DUP votes, because 50% of the votes on Brexit legislation depended upon DUP support. Without our support, the amendments would have been made to the legislation which would in effect have killed Brexit. So far we have delivered, but we will deliver on what we promised and the agreement that we entered into with the government. We'll not deliver on something different.
Strong words, Sammy Wilson. Thank you very much. And now back in the studio, I'm delighted to be joined by Lisa Cameron, the SNP MP for East Kilbride, Strathaven and West Mahago. Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show, Lisa.
Thank you very much.
Now, is there anything that Theresa May can deliver in terms of a Brexit deal that would persuade the SNP benches to give her some support?
Well, if she were able to come back from the EU with a deal that accepted full access to the single market and customs union, then that might be a situation that could be agreeable, but that seems to be something she's not keen to do, and certainly her MPs are not looking for themselves.
Now, at the SNP conference in Glasgow earlier this week, there was a shift in position towards supporting the people's vote, as it's called. How significant could that be?
Well, that could be significant because if Labour and the Conservatives have divisions in terms of the type of Brexit they would like to see, then perhaps a Brexit deal can't be agreed through Parliament. Then it goes back to the people to decide what should happen.
How about those in the party who previously had suggested, look, this is a dangerous precedent for the SNP because it might mean there has to be an affirmative second referendum if there's another Scottish referendum on independence?
But at the same time, I'm looking for a second referendum on independence, so you have to look at both sides of that coin, and that's my key aim for the future. So having a second referendum when there is I think a distinct change in circumstance is the platform for that, and that would set a precedent, surely.
When do you think this matter will come to absolute decision? Is it not until January that the absolute deadline comes down when Theresa May has to get the Commons backing or she's finished as Prime Minister?
Well, that's very possible. I think that the negotiations will go down to the last moment, and I imagine that those will be tough negotiations.
Now, yesterday was the first Prime Minister's questions. Everybody back to school after the party conference season. What was your sense of the mood across the parliamentary chamber?
There was a definite sense of there being a lack of direction in terms of the government and its position on Brexit. And of course, there's also a lack of direction on the Labour benches. So there's a feeling that of confusion, perhaps, amongst MPs and anticipation for the big votes to come.
Well, Lisa Cameron, neither of us can forecast the future, but what I can say for definite is I'm delighted to present you with the Alex Salmond Quake for appearing on the show.
Thank you so much.
Now, I don't have to tell you the drill. You know full well the uses to which a quake can be put.
Yes, indeed. And thank you so much for giving this to me, and I'll be sharing it with friends in the future.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Well, we've just been through a conference season where both the main Westminster parties will be reasonably satisfied. Their under-pressure leaders were seen to have performed better than their detractors hoped, and a lot better than their advisers feared. Jeremy Corbyn sees the glimmer of the prize of a general election. Theresa May sees the glimmer of an opportunity that her hitherto friendless Chequers compromise might at last be attracting some support, if only as the least worst option, everybody's third choice. Meanwhile, the SNP must be buoyed by the huge numbers turning out to demand independence on the streets of Scotland's capital. The grassroots troops are certainly mobilised to an even greater degree than in 2014. As we've seen from Kate Hoey and Sammy Wilson, the Prime Minister is not without potential swing support among other parties for a Brexit position. However, in neither case can that support be taken for granted, and in neither case does it seem to be for the Prime Minister's present Brexit position. All of which means that this autumn we'll see some knife-edge votes in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister's team may hope they'll all be over by Christmas. But on the other hand, it's difficult to see how the Chequers plan, which few really understand and even fewer really support, can possibly prevail. What is more certain, it will be back next week. And so from Tasmina and me and all at the show, it's goodbye for now.